What began as an ordinary workday inside the glass-walled offices of Logan Creations unfolded into a moment that quietly, irrevocably shifted the future of several lives. Will Spencer had never considered himself someone who stumbled into destiny-altering truths. He was methodical, observant, careful to stay within his lane, especially in a place as politically delicate as Logan Creations, where family history and business ambition were inseparably tangled. Yet fate has a way of exploiting routine. While reviewing archived vendor contracts and legacy branding files requested for an upcoming corporate audit, Will encountered a sealed digital folder that did not belong to the current project. It was misfiled, dated decades earlier, labeled with an internal reference code rather than a name. Curiosity alone would not have pushed him to open it, but something about the encryption flags suggested the file had been deliberately buried rather than forgotten. Inside were old medical billing statements, a private legal memorandum, and fragments of correspondence that seemed out of place among fashion line proposals. Slowly, the implication took shape in his mind, not as a single explosive revelation, but as a creeping certainty. Dates aligned too perfectly. A confidential maternity clinic invoice corresponded with a time when Katie Logan had abruptly left Los Angeles under vague pretenses. A legal document referenced a child placed under a different maternal identity, with provisions for lifelong secrecy. The final piece, a handwritten note scanned and attached, bore Katie's unmistakable signature. The realization did not crash into Will all at once. It seeped in, heavy and disorienting, suggesting that Katie Logan was not merely connected to Daphne's past, but was, in fact, her biological mother. Will closed the file and sat motionless, acutely aware that he was holding knowledge capable of detonating a family. The weight of it pressed against his chest, not as triumph, but as dread. Katie Logan was not just a corporate figure, or a familiar surname to him. She was woven into the emotional fabric of his life, someone whose resilience he respected, and whose vulnerabilities he understood better than most. The idea that she had lived with a secret of this magnitude, carrying it silently through years of public scrutiny and personal upheaval, unsettled him deeply. At the same time, Daphne was no longer an abstract name attached to old documents. She was a woman on the brink of marriage, someone whose life was actively unfolding, unaware that the foundation beneath her identity was about to fracture. Will understood, almost instinctively, that there was no harmless way forward from this moment. Silence would be complicity. Revelation would be devastation. He lingered in that impossible space, knowing that whatever choice he made would mark him forever. While Will grappled with his discovery, Donna Logan was fighting a quieter, more familiar battle, one rooted in intuition rather than evidence. For years, she had sensed the presence of something unresolved in Katie's life, a sorrow that surfaced unpredictably, especially when conversations drifted toward motherhood, legacy, or the passage of time. Donna had never pressed too hard, respecting the boundaries Katie so carefully maintained, but Daphne's impending wedding shifted something within her. Weddings had a way of forcing truths into the open, of demanding honesty not just between partners, but across generations. Donna watched Katie grow increasingly withdrawn as the preparations intensified, her smiles more strained, her reassurances less convincing. The past was not staying buried, it was stirring. Donna's concern sharpened into urgency. She confronted Katie gently at first, urging her to consider the consequences of continued silence. Secrets, Donna believed, were not static things. They grew heavier with time, more volatile, and eventually they chose their own moment to explode. Katie resisted, insisting that revealing the truth would only cause pain, that Daphne was better protected by ignorance than burdened by betrayal. Yet even as she spoke, Katie's resolve wavered. Donna saw it clearly, the way fear and love were locked in combat inside her sister. Donna's pleas became more insistent, not out of judgment, but desperation. She knew, perhaps better than Katie herself, that the cost of delay was rising with every passing day. Unable to bear the secret alone, Will sought counsel, turning to someone who understood both the personal and familial stakes. Whether it was RJ, with his deep ties to the Forrester legacy, or Liam, whose life had been shaped by revelations and reversals, Will found himself articulating the truth in fragments rather than declarations. He spoke cautiously, outlining the documents without naming conclusions outright, watching as comprehension dawned on the listener's face. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. Questions surfaced not just about Katie, but about Daphne's entire narrative, about the woman she believed to be her mother, about the timing of her engagement, about the ethical implications of allowing a marriage to proceed under false pretenses. Doubt spread quickly, infecting assumptions that had once seemed secure. The realization that Daphne's identity might be built on a deliberate omission cast a shadow over the joyous anticipation surrounding her wedding. Will felt both relief and regret in sharing the burden. The secret was no longer his alone, but the circle of those affected was widening, and he could sense the approaching storm. Daphne herself was already struggling beneath the surface, though she could not have named the source of her unease. As her wedding to Carter Walton drew closer, the excitement she had expected to feel was punctured by a persistent sense of displacement. Questions about her past, long dormant, began to resurface uninvited. She found herself fixated on small inconsistencies in her memories, moments when her mother had deflected questions, or shifted conversations away from her early childhood. What she had once dismissed as protectiveness now felt like evasion. Preparing for marriage sharpened her awareness of lineage and belonging, of the stories that families passed down. Daphne wanted certainty, a clear narrative she could carry into her future, yet the closer she came to that future, the more fragmented her past appeared. Her anxiety intensified when she overheard a tense, half-whispered conversation, voices heavy with emotion and restraint. Though she could not catch every word, the names mentioned, the urgency in their tones, confirmed her growing suspicion that something significant was being withheld from her. The knowledge that others were discussing her life, without her consent, ignited a sense of betrayal she could not yet fully articulate. The truth did not emerge quietly. It never does. It erupted during the pre-wedding celebration, an event meant to symbolize unity and joy, attended by members of both the Logan and Forrester families. The atmosphere was charged with expectation, laughter layered over unspoken tension. When the revelation finally surfaced, it did so with a force that silenced the room. The disclosure cut through polite conversation and festive decor, reducing everything to a single, inescapable reality. Gasps rippled outward as understanding took hold, expressions shifting from confusion to shock, from denial to recognition. Daphne stood at the center of the chaos, her world tilting violently as the truth crystallized before her. The woman she had trusted, the history she had believed, the future she was preparing to embrace, all collided in that moment. The faces around her blurred, but Katie stood out with devastating clarity. In that instant, Daphne saw not just a secret exposed, but years of deliberate silence reframed as a choice that had defined her life without her knowledge. Confrontation was inevitable. Daphne demanded answers not as a child seeking comfort, but as a woman whose autonomy had been compromised. Her anger was raw, sharpened by the realization that her identity had been shaped by decisions made without her consent. She questioned not only the lie itself, but the motivations behind it, the moments when truth could have been offered and was not. Facing Katie, Daphne felt the full weight of betrayal settle into her chest. Love did not soften the impact, it complicated it. She oscillated between grief for what she had lost and fury for what had been stolen. Katie, confronted at last, could no longer hide behind protective intentions or deferred timing. The reckoning she had feared was upon her, and there was no version of events that would spare everyone pain. Carter Walton, drawn into the fallout, experienced his own reckoning. The revelation forced him to reevaluate not only Daphne's past, but their shared future. He had believed he was entering a marriage grounded in transparency, mutual trust, and emotional stability. Now he faced the reality that his partner was navigating an identity crisis at the very moment they were meant to be committing to one another. Carter's shock was tempered by concern, but uncertainty crept in nonetheless. He questioned whether love alone could withstand the magnitude of what had been uncovered, whether their relationship could survive the recalibration required by such a fundamental truth. The future he had envisioned suddenly felt provisional, contingent on outcomes he could not control. Katie's confession, when it finally came, was not dramatic, but devastating in its sincerity. She laid bare the fear that had guided her decisions, the belief that secrecy was a form of protection rather than cowardice. She spoke of youth, of vulnerability, of circumstances that had left her feeling unprepared to be the mother Daphne deserved. She explained how time had transformed an initial choice into a lifelong burden, how each year of silence made the truth harder to reveal. Her plea for forgiveness was not strategic, but human, born of regret and longing. She did not ask to be absolved, she asked to be understood. Whether that understanding would come, she did not know. In the aftermath, both the Logan and Forrester families were left to navigate the wreckage. Relationships were redefined, alliances strained, and plans once considered certain were thrown into doubt. Daphne's wedding, once a symbol of hope and continuity, now stood as a question mark, its future uncertain. The families faced not only the challenge of repairing trust, but of accepting that some fractures leave permanent marks. As emotions settled into uneasy quiet, one truth remained undeniable: the past, no matter how carefully hidden, always finds its way into the present. And when it does, it demands to be reckoned with, reshaping lives in ways no one can fully predict. The period when Carter Walton and Daphne first allowed themselves to believe in the durability of what they were building together felt almost suspended outside of time. Their days moved with a gentle intensity, each moment layered with the quiet assurance that comes when affection deepens into something steadier, something that no longer needs constant validation. Carter, accustomed to the sharp edges of corporate rivalry and legal maneuvering, found an unfamiliar softness in Daphne's presence. With her, conversations stretched beyond strategy and obligation into shared reflections about ambition, vulnerability, and the possibility of a future unburdened by the endless conflicts that defined their professional worlds. Daphne, for her part, saw in Carter a rare combination of strength and restraint, a man capable of authority without cruelty, ambition without emptiness. Their connection did not blaze recklessly, it warmed gradually, drawing them closer with a sense of inevitability that felt both exhilarating and safe. In those early weeks, trust formed quietly, built on routines, on the ease with which they shared space, on the assumption that what they offered each other was sincere. Yet beneath that warmth, unspoken tensions lingered, tied to histories neither of them had fully explored. Daphne carried a truth that had reshaped her understanding of herself, one she had not yet decided how to integrate into the life she was building with Carter. The revelation of her biological origins had unsettled her deeply, not because it altered her feelings for the woman who raised her, but because it forced her to reevaluate the narrative of her own identity. Katie Logan was no longer a distant figure associated with industry power and public confidence. She was suddenly, irrevocably, part of Daphne's most private story. Daphne wrestled with when and how to share this truth with Carter, aware that secrecy itself could become a betrayal if left unaddressed. She feared his reaction not because she doubted his capacity for empathy, but because she understood the world he inhabited, a world shaped by corporate competition where lineage and loyalty were rarely neutral facts. When Daphne finally chose to tell him, it was not during an argument or a moment of crisis, but during an evening meant to celebrate how far they had come. The calmness of the setting made the confession feel even more destabilizing. Her voice, steady but strained, carried the weight of weeks of deliberation, as she explained that Katie Logan was her biological mother. Carter listened in silence, his expression unreadable, the pause that followed stretching longer than Daphne had anticipated. The words themselves were simple, but their implications unfurled rapidly in his mind, touching every corner of his professional and personal life. Shock was his first response, a visceral jolt that disrupted the emotional rhythm they had established. He had expected surprises in life, but not one so intricately tied to the fault lines between their respective worlds. As the initial shock receded, a more troubling set of questions emerged. Carter could not separate Daphne's revelation from the reality that Katie Logan controlled Logan Designs, a company whose rivalry with Forrester Creations was not merely theoretical, but deeply personal and financially consequential. Years of legal battles, strategic positioning, and corporate defense mechanisms had conditioned him to scrutinize motives instinctively. He wondered whether Daphne had known this truth earlier than she admitted, whether her presence in his life coincided too conveniently with shifts in corporate dynamics. The possibility that she might be an unwitting or willing conduit for information unsettled him, not only because it threatened Forrester Creations, but because it cast doubt on the authenticity of the bond he cherished. Carter's internal conflict intensified as he tried to reconcile his emotional experience with his professional instincts. On one hand, he remembered moments of vulnerability Daphne had shared, instances of hesitation and self-doubt that felt profoundly genuine. On the other, his training as an attorney and executive urged caution, reminding him that personal relationships had often been weaponized in the corporate wars he navigated daily. The idea that Daphne could be exploiting his trust for strategic advantage felt corrosive, yet impossible to dismiss entirely. Carter found himself replaying conversations, searching for hidden meanings, re-examining gestures that had once seemed spontaneous. What troubled him most was not the fear of betrayal itself, but the realization that his doubt, once planted, was reshaping his perception of everything they shared. Unable to confront Daphne directly with accusations he could not yet substantiate, Carter chose a quieter path, one that allowed his suspicion to unfold gradually. He began observing her more closely, attuned to shifts in tone, pauses in conversation, moments when her curiosity veered toward topics she had previously shown little interest in. He noticed how she listened when he spoke about work, how her questions, though framed casually, sometimes lingered on specifics related to Forrester Creations. These observations did not amount to proof, yet they reinforced his unease. Each ambiguous detail became another thread woven into a narrative of doubt he struggled to control. Carter's approach grew more deliberate. He introduced seemingly innocuous references to Logan Designs into their conversations, gauging Daphne's reactions. He spoke hypothetically about industry trends, about competitive strategies, about challenges facing both companies, watching for signs of alignment or deflection. His questions were carefully phrased, designed to elicit insight, without revealing his true intent. Daphne, perceptive by nature, sensed the shift immediately. The ease that once defined their exchanges began to fracture, replaced by a subtle tension that neither of them could ignore. She felt scrutinized, her words weighed with an intensity that made her increasingly self-conscious. Daphne's discomfort soon turned into frustration. She had revealed her truth as an act of trust, believing honesty would strengthen their relationship rather than destabilize it. Instead, she found herself navigating an unspoken interrogation, her sincerity questioned, not through direct confrontation, but through Carter's persistent probing. The realization hurt more than she expected. She attempted to reassure him, emphasizing that her connection to Katie Logan did not define her intentions or loyalties. She spoke of her desire to build a life independent of corporate allegiances, of her commitment to Carter as a partner rather than a strategic asset. Yet even as she explained herself, she sensed that her words were meeting resistance, filtered through a lens of suspicion she could not dismantle alone. Carter listened, outwardly composed, inwardly divided. Daphne's explanations resonated emotionally, yet the seed of doubt had already taken root too deeply to be dislodged by reassurance alone. He struggled with the contradiction between what he felt and what he feared. His affection for Daphne remained intact, but it now coexisted with a vigilance that drained joy from their interactions. He questioned his own capacity for trust, wondering whether his skepticism was a protective instinct or a projection of his own unresolved anxieties about power and control. The more he analyzed the situation, the less certain he became, trapped in a cycle of suspicion that offered no clear resolution. The strain began to manifest in subtle but significant ways. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now stalled under the weight of unspoken concerns. Shared moments of intimacy were punctuated by hesitation, as if both were bracing for an inevitable confrontation neither knew how to initiate. Daphne felt herself withdrawing emotionally, not out of guilt, but out of self-preservation. She resented the implication that her identity rendered her inherently untrustworthy, that her lineage overshadowed her autonomy. Carter, in turn, felt increasingly isolated within his own doubts, aware that his silence was eroding the very trust he sought to protect. As days passed, the emotional distance between them widened. Carter's internal narrative grew more elaborate, fueled by the absence of definitive answers. He imagined scenarios in which confidential information slipped casually from conversation to strategy, from personal intimacy to corporate advantage. Each imagined betrayal compounded his anxiety, even as he acknowledged the lack of concrete evidence. Daphne, sensing the shift, but lacking clarity about its source, oscillated between patience and anger. She wanted to fight for their relationship, yet she refused to accept a role defined by suspicion rather than mutual respect. The relationship, once grounded in warmth and shared aspiration, now stood at a precarious crossroads. Carter recognized that his mistrust, left unchecked, could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, destroying what he valued most. Daphne faced a different reckoning, forced to decide whether she could remain in a partnership where her honesty was met with doubt rather than understanding. Both were acutely aware that the challenge before them was not merely about corporate rivalry or hidden motives, but about the fundamental question of whether love could survive without trust. In the quiet moments when they were apart, Carter reflected on the irony of his situation. He had spent years advocating for transparency and ethical conduct, yet now found himself concealing his true feelings behind calculated observation. Daphne, meanwhile, grappled with the pain of being reduced to a potential liability, her individuality eclipsed by the shadow of her mother's influence. Their shared future hung in the balance, threatened not by overt betrayal, but by the corrosive power of doubt left unspoken. As the tension deepened, it became clear that avoidance was no longer an option. The path forward demanded confrontation, honesty unfiltered by fear or suspicion. Whether that confrontation would lead to reconciliation or rupture remained uncertain. What was undeniable, however, was that their relationship had entered its most critical phase, tested not by external opposition alone, but by the fragile, easily fractured trust that lay at its core.